Star Trek's coolest new vehicle has a surprising connection to J.J. Abrams' 2009 movie. The Sailfish is the coolest new vehicle in the Star Trek universe, and it has a surprising connection to J.J. Abrams' 2009 reboot. J.J. Abrams was brought on board to help retool Star Trek for a new generation. The movie significantly updated Star Trek's look, introducing some sleek new ships, one of which was the Jellyfish. Now, Star Trek Annual 2024 reveals the Sailfish's connection to the Jellyfish. Star Trek Annual 2024 is written by Jackson Lanzing and Colin Kelly and drawn by Rachel Stott. Data and O'Brien have tracked lore to Farius Prime, where they encounter the remnants of the Red Path. After fighting off their attackers, they are rescued by Geordi LaForge, who is piloting a slick-looking new spacecraft called Sailfish. A text piece, made to resemble a Starfleet briefing, reveals the Sailfish is LaForge's new pet projects and is a prototype for a more advanced craft still on the drawing board, the Jellyfish. J.J. Abrams breathed new life into the Star Trek universe in 2009 to help work around decades of continuity. Abrams and his collaborators opted to create a new Star Trek timeline where they could tell new stories without treading over what came before. The writers then needed a way to create this new timeline. To this end, Spock, in an experimental ship, tries to stop the Romulan supernova, but instead is thrown back in time. The ship was unique, unlike any other Starfleet vessel fans had seen. While it did not receive a name in any of the films, behind-the-scenes material called it the Jellyfish. The 2009 Star Trek film also did not give any background information on the Jellyfish, but licensed tie-in media such as novels and comics have filled in some of the gaps. The miniseries Countdown, a prologue to the film released by IDW, revealed that Geordi LaForge had a hand in building the Jellyfish. While this was not in any canon materials, fans have nevertheless latched on to the idea. Star Trek Annual 2024 not only confirms LaForge built it, but he also created a prototype as well, the Sailfish. The Romulan supernova is coming, and Spock will need help to stop it. IDW's Star Trek comics are slowly building to the events that led Spock to use the Jellyfish in the first place. Star Trek Defiant has dropped hints that the Romulan supernova is beginning to build. Spock has noticed, but is keeping it to himself for the time being. How the Sailfish will factor into later stories, if at all, remains to be seen, but it will no doubt come onto Spock's radar. However, the Sailfish has a great destiny ahead of it, paving the way for the Jellyfish, which helps kick off J.J. Abrams' 2009 movie. 8 years later, I still think Star Trek Beyond is the best J.J. Abrams movie. It's been 8 years since Star Trek Beyond, the best of J.J. Abrams' 3 Star Trek movies, was released. When the movie was released in 2016, I wasn't particularly excited, given the disaster that was Star Trek Into Darkness. Still, I trooped along to my local multiplex on opening night, hoping that finally this would be the Chris Pine Star Trek movie that managed to capture the spirit of Gene Roddenberry while also being an accessible summer blockbuster. Although I was still skeptical about this, I did concede that the signs were promising. Although he wasn't an obvious fit for the franchise, director Justin Lin's work on the Fast and Furious movies proved that he could handle the thrilling action set pieces that had become a key part of J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies. Simon Pegg's cult sitcom Spaced and his subsequent Cornetto trilogy of movies proved that he was a screenwriter who wore his nerd credentials on his sleeve. If he and co-writer Doug Jung could balance Pegg's nerdy excesses with a solid Star Trek story, then we'd be in for a treat. Thankfully, Lin, Pegg, and Jung's work on Star Trek Beyond succeeded on all fronts. Star Trek Beyond is the best of the Kelvin Timeline movies. Star Trek Beyond learns from the mistakes made by Star Trek Into Darkness to deliver a blockbuster action movie that stays true to the spirit of the franchise. Where Into Darkness was inspired by the bleakness of Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, Star Trek Beyond owes a debt to 2012's The Avengers. Like The Avengers, Star Trek Beyond is an ensemble piece that gives every key member of the Enterprise crew a genuine hero moment. In Star Trek terms, Beyond is the Kelvin Timeline movie that comes closest to recreating Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, aka the one with the whales. Idris Elba's villain and the climactic battle to save Yorktown also feels like a substantial blockbuster upgrade on Zachary Quinto and Benedict Cumberbatch's fight scene in Star Trek Into Darkness. That saw Spock and Khan Noonien Singh jump from hovering freighter to hovering freighter against a drab Earth background. Star Trek Beyond gives us a zero-G battle between Idris Elba and Chris Pine in a collapsing space station. It's more dynamically directed, more in character because it's Kirk, not Spock, and crucially feels more Star Trek than the earthbound slugfest from Star Trek Into Darkness. I wish we got more Star Trek movies like Beyond. Star Trek Beyond was the movie I wanted when J.J. Abrams rebooted the timeline back in 2009. It told a fresh story with familiar characters, retooling Star Trek for the cinematic landscape of the mid to late 2010s. That's what these movies should have been doing from the beginning, rather than getting hung up on existing Star Trek lore. While Idris Elba's villain and the USS Franklin connect Beyond with the Bakula era, those revelations are Easter eggs for die-hard fans, not turned into a major plot point to alienate the average moviegoer. The problem with Star Trek Into Darkness, and to a lesser extent, Star Trek 2009, was that they professed to be accessible to a new audience, but layered on heaps of lore and continuity. I'd argue that the reason Star Trek Beyond performed poorly at the box office was because Into Darkness was so incomprehensible that audiences weren't keen to come back. Leonard Nimoy passing the torch to Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto in Star Trek 2009 was a touching send-off. Leonard Nimoy info-dumping about Khan Noonien Singh proved the script didn't do enough to sell Benedict Cumberbatch as a villain. Ultimately, Star Trek Beyond showed the way forward for the movie's standalone, blockbuster-scale adventures for the crew of the USS Enterprise. These adventures can play in the giant toy box that is the Star Trek universe, but a good story shouldn't come second to headline-grabbing legacy characters. Sadly, the box office performance of Star Trek Beyond appeared to teach Paramount Studios all the wrong lessons about the movie franchise, as its sequel remains in development hell 8 years later. It's disappointing because Star Trek Beyond was the Kelvin Timeline crew's finest hour, and they deserve one last hurrah. The problem with Star Trek Into Darkness and, to a lesser extent, Star Trek 2009 was that they professed to be accessible to a new audience, but layered on heaps of lore and continuity. I'd argue that the reason Star Trek Beyond performed poorly at the box office was because Into Darkness was so incomprehensible that audiences weren't keen to come back. Leonard Nimoy passing the torch to Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto in Star Trek 2009 was a touching send-off. Leonard Nimoy info-dumping about Khan Noonien Singh proved the script didn't do enough to sell Benedict Cumberbatch as a villain. Ultimately, Star Trek Beyond showed the way forward for the movie's standalone, blockbuster-scale adventures for the crew of the USS Enterprise. These adventures can play in the giant toy box that is the Star Trek universe, but a good story shouldn't come second to headline-grabbing legacy characters. Sadly, the box office performance of Star Trek Beyond appeared to teach Paramount Studios all the wrong lessons about the movie franchise, as its sequel remains in development hell 8 years later. It's disappointing because Star Trek Beyond was the Kelvin Timeline crew's finest hour, and they deserve one last hurrah. Ultimately, Star Trek Beyond showed the way forward for the movie's standalone, blockbuster-scale adventures for the crew of the USS Enterprise. These adventures can play in the giant toy box that is the Star Trek universe, but a good story shouldn't come second to headline-grabbing legacy characters. Sadly,